For 200 years, this demon has looked at nothing but the wall. 6 escapes. He ate the last guard, partially. And now a new guard leans his halberd against the wall. He sits down on the icy floor directly across from the bars and asks the demon devourer what his name is. But let's go back an hour. The cold strikes first. Not winter's cold, stone's cold. Only a man who hasn't seen the sun for hundreds of years can withstand such cold stone that hasn't seen the sun in hundreds of years. Dan Sho opens his eyes. Above him is a low, soot-stained ceiling with a crack running from wall to wall. His head is buzzing, as if someone had struck his skull with a bell from the inside. He raises his hand to his face and doesn't recognize it. The fingers are thin, young. These hands are 18 years old. But he is 34. He remembers the knife. He remembers how the steel slid under his ribs easily, without resistance. He remembers the asphalt, the smell of beer and blood. And then this ceiling, this stone, this thin, unfamiliar body in chainmail that hangs as if on a coat hanger. He stands up. His legs are shaking. Fragments of someone else's memory flash through his mind. A boy. Dan Sho. The youngest son of an impoverished family of jailers. His father sent him here with a single phrase, "Don't disgrace the family name." Here, to Anhelm, and along with that word comes a realization that sends a chill down his spine. A prison. 12 circles down. Carved into the crater of a dead volcano, and inside, demons, beings older than human civilization. 2,000 years ago, they were locked up here after the Great War of the Seals. The Light Coalition defeated the Dark Host but failed to kill its leaders. Some were bound to the very fabric of the world. Kill them and you tear reality apart. That's why they built Anhelm. They locked everyone away down below, and above, the walls of the Holy See rose, where the conclave took its seat. The theocracy holds power on one simple premise: we guard the demons, therefore you need us. But Dan Sho is no longer Dan Sho. Inside the boy, Daniel Shaw has awakened. A former social worker from Portland, 10 years in probation services, teenagers, ex-cons, the ones everyone had turned their backs on. His job was to sit across from a broken man and ask questions. So, how are we going to move forward? He died a stupid death. He stepped in to break up a bar fight. A habit. Just a habit. And now he's standing in a guard room the size of a closet. On the table is the round-the-clock log, 40 cells in the 3rd circle, and the instructions. He holds them up to the torch. Do not speak to the prisoners. Do not respond to requests. If they attempt to speak, strike the bars 3 times with the handle of the torch. He reads it over 3 times, puts it back, rubs his face with someone else's palms, and smirks. This is solitary confinement. The most ordinary, classic maximum security isolation cell. Only with dragons. He hasn't worked with dragons before, but the principle is the same. A person in a cage begins to rot after 6 weeks of silence. It doesn't matter if they're human or demon. Silence kills more reliably than any torture. And these ones have been sitting here for 17 centuries. What's even left of them? He picks up a halberd. His grip is wrong. Someone else's muscle memory tells him the correct grip is different. But the correct grip is the one for striking, and he has no intention of hitting anyone. The corridor of the 3rd circle is shrouded in darkness. Every other torch is lit. The walls are covered in soot and something that glistens like saliva. The floor is worn to a shine in the middle and covered in dust at the edges. Thousands of feet have walked here, all in the center. No one approached the walls. No one approached the bars. He walks past the 1st cell. Something is stirring there. Past the 2nd. Heat radiates from it like from a furnace. The 3rd cell, cell 3G. He freezes. Behind the bars, 6 points of light glow in the darkness. 3 pairs of eyes. They stare at him without blinking. From the log, he knows who's in there. Wurm the Thirsty. The devouring demon. 6 escapes in 200 years. He devoured the last guard who went inside. Partially. That word stands in the logbook without explanation. Daniel stares at the 6 glowing eyes. The eyes are waiting. What are they waiting for? A blow from the halberd shaft. Silence. Footsteps receding down the hallway. He leans the halberd against the wall. He sits down on the floor. The stone burns with cold. He says his name is Dan, that he's new here. He apologizes for the disturbance and asks what the name is of the one sitting behind the bars. The cell falls silent. Not just silent as it gets when something very old and very dangerous for the first time in 100 years doesn't understand what's happening. 6 eyes blink, all 6 at once. Daniel waits. He knows how to wait. 10 years on the job have drilled one thing into him. Silence after a question isn't a refusal. It's processing. Someone's thinking fast. Someone hasn't heard a polite word in half a century and needs time to remember how to respond. A minute. 5. 10. A sound creeps out of the darkness, low, grating, as if stones were rubbing against each other. Then a voice, hoarse, cracked. A voice that hasn't been used in so long that it has almost forgotten how to sound. Wurm states his name, just his name. Daniel nods, says he's glad to meet him. He stands up. He brushes the stone dust off his pants. He walks on. At the 4th cell, he sits down again. He introduces himself again. He asks for the name again. Silence. He walks to the 5th, to the 6th, to the 10th. Out of 40 cells, 3 respond. 3 on his first round. For his first day in a maximum security detention center, that's an excellent result. He knows it. On his first day in Portland, only 1 teenager out of 12 answered him, and that one responded with a curse. He returns to the guardhouse. He opens the logbook. In the remarks column, he writes, "Rounds complete. No incidents." He closes it. Then he opens it again, and in the margins, in small handwriting, he adds, "Cell 3G Wurm," responds to his name. His voice is hoarse. He hasn't spoken in a long time. Cell 3D. Silence, but movement closer to the bars after the question. Cell 3Z. A reply in an unfamiliar language. The tone isn't aggressive. He closes the logbook, lies down on the cot. The ceiling has a crack. Stone. Cold. A torch that's about to burn out. Tomorrow he'll come again. He'll say the same words. He'll sit on the same floor. And he'll wait. Because that's how it works. Not out of force. Not through fear. Through a dull, stubborn, daily presence. He falls asleep with that thought. And in cell 3G, Wurm the Thirsty lies with his snout pressed against the bars, staring down the corridor. For the first time in 200 years, he isn't staring at the wall. The second day began with a scream, not a demonic one, a human one. Senior guard Grant Morley stood over Daniel and yelled that the shift had started 20 minutes ago. Daniel jumped up from his cot. His chainmail had twisted in his sleep and was digging into his ribs. Morley was a burly man in his 40s with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same stone as the walls of Anhelm. He said that the new recruit, Sho, was getting his first warning. A second warning meant a reduction in rations. A third meant he'd be transferred to cleaning the latrines of the 9th Circle. Daniel nodded and said he understood. Morley looked at him strangely. He was apparently expecting excuses or fear. He got neither. He muttered something about young people and walked away. Daniel straightened himself up. He couldn't get the chainmail to lie flat. It just hung there crookedly. He grabbed the halberd with the same awkward grip and stepped out into the corridor. Morning in Angelma was no different from night. There was no sun here. The 3rd Circle lay at a depth where the concepts of morning and evening were determined solely by the torchbearer's schedule. Every 12 hours, a designated person walked down the corridor and replaced the torches. Right now, the torches were fresh. The corridor looked almost cozy, if you forgot that behind every grate sat a creature capable of destroying a small town. Daniel began his rounds. Cell 3A. He introduced himself. Silence. Cell 3B. He introduced himself. Silence. Cell 3G. Wurm. Daniel stopped. 6 eyes were already staring at him. They were waiting. He sat down on the floor. He said good morning. He said he'd come as promised, although he hadn't actually promised anything. But in his line of work, words don't always need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes a promise is simply the fact that you've returned. Wurm was silent, but he was lying closer to the bars than yesterday, half a meter closer. Daniel noticed. He always noticed things like that. In Portland, he'd noticed when a teenager sat facing him for the first time, instead of with his side turned toward him. When a former inmate didn't cross his arms over his chest for the first time. Half a meter. For a creature that had been sitting in the far corner for 200 years, half a meter was a breakthrough. Daniel took a piece of hardtack out of his pocket, a guard's ration. He placed it by the bars. He said he didn't know if demons ate hardtack, but if Wurm wanted it, he should take it. Wurm looked at the hardtack, then at Daniel, then back at the cracker. He didn't take it, but he didn't look away either. Daniel nodded and walked on. At the 3D cell, he sat down again. Someone invisible in the darkness was sitting in that cell. There had been movement yesterday, today too, closer to the bars. Daniel introduced himself. He asked for a name. Silence, but a different kind of silence, not empty, but full. Someone was listening. Daniel said he'd come back tomorrow. He stood up and walked to the next cell. 40 cells, 2 hours. His feet ached from the stone floor. By the end of his rounds, he'd counted 5 reactions. Yesterday there were 3. On the way back, he noticed that the cracker had disappeared from cell 3G. Morley was waiting for him at the guard post. Standing next to Morley was a man Daniel was seeing for the first time. Tall, lean, around 50 years old. A guard's uniform, but of a different cut, better tailored. On his shoulder was an insignia with 2 crossed keys. A captain. Morley introduced him as Captain Ray Holloway, commander of the 3rd and 4th Circle Guards. Holloway looked at Daniel the way a pathologist looks at an interesting case. Without hostility, but with professional curiosity towards something that didn't fit the usual picture. He said he'd received Morley's morning report. The report stated that the new guard, Sho, had taken 2 hours to complete his rounds instead of the prescribed 40 minutes. Daniel replied that he had been delayed because he was checking on the prisoner's condition. Holloway raised an eyebrow. He asked what exactly he was checking. Daniel said he was checking their physical condition, body position, movement, and signs of life. He deliberately used bureaucratic language. In Portland, he'd learned to speak to his superiors in their own language. Superiors love precise phrasing. Phrasing turns strange behavior into a work process. Holloway was silent for a moment. Then he said that the rounds should take 40 minutes, no more. Daniel nodded. Holloway left. Morley looked at Daniel and tapped his temple with his finger. He said Daniel shouldn't draw the captain's attention during his first week. Daniel agreed. But on the next round, he spent 2 hours again. By the 3rd day, he'd changed his tactics. At cell 3, he sat down and pulled not a cracker, but a rag dampened with water out of his pocket. He placed it by the bars. Wurm was lying 3 meters away. His scales were dull and dry. In places, they were cracked. Daniel had read in a journal that Wurm-class devouring demons were originally aquatic creatures. He hadn't read that in the magazine. He found it in his new memory. Dan Sho's memory contained fragments of school lessons on demonology. An aquatic creature in a dry stone chamber for 200 years. Daniel imagined a fish in the desert and clenched his teeth. The Wurm looked at the wet rag, its 6 eyes narrowed. Then it slowly stretched one of its front paws. Its claws scraped against the stone. The paw was enormous. It could have closed around Daniel entirely. But instead, it gently pulled the rag toward itself. Wurm pressed the wet cloth against its snout. It froze. Its 6 eyes closed. The sound it made was quiet, almost inaudible, something between an exhalation and a groan. Daniel sat motionless. He knew that sound. He'd heard it dozens of times. That's what a creature sounds like when, for the first time in a very long time, the pain has eased just a little. On the 4th day, Daniel came to cell 3G with a bucket of water. Real water. River water. He got up at 4 in the morning, according to the torchbearer schedule. He went up 2 levels. Auer drove a service tanker, filled a bucket, went back down. The bucket was heavy. The arms of his 18-year-old body weren't used to carrying heavy loads. He stopped twice on the stairs, set the bucket down by the bars of cell 3G, sat down next to it. Said that the logbook stated that Wurm had tried to escape 6 times. He said he wouldn't ask why. He said he wanted to ask where. There had to be a place he'd been running to. Wurm was silent. Daniel waited. 40 minutes. He leaned his back against the wall opposite the cell. The stone felt cold against his back through the chainmail. The corridor was quiet. Even the torches crackled somewhat muffled, as if they didn't want to disturb him. Then Wurm spoke. His voice was different, not the rasping one from the first day. Quieter, softer. He said it was up north. He had a pond there. Daniel nodded. He asked him to tell him about the pond. Wurm talked for 20 minutes. About the reeds, about the fish that weren't afraid of him, about how the moonlight fell on the water, about the frogs that sang at night. His voice trembled. It cracked. It would fall silent and then start again. 200 years. For 200 years that memory had lain at the bottom like a stone, and no one had ever asked him to bring it up. When Wurm fell silent, Daniel said it was a beautiful place. He stood up. He moved the bucket closer to the grate, and he left. He didn't look back, but he heard a splash behind him, and then a sound. Quiet. Wet. Wurm was crying. Streams of water ran down his scales. Daniel walked down the hallway, thinking that tomorrow he would bring 2 buckets. On the morning of the 5th day, Morley stopped him in the hallway. Morley's face looked strange. Not angry, confused. He said he'd walked past cell 3G on his night rounds. Wurm was lying with his snout toward the exit. Calm, like a dog waiting for its owner. Morley had worked at Anhelm for 20 years. Over those 20 years, Wurm had killed 2 guards and maimed 5. Morley asked what Daniel had done to him. Daniel shrugged. He said nothing, just asked how he was doing. Morley looked at him for a long time. Then he said that Daniel was either lying or insane, and he left. Daniel thought that they'd told him the same thing in Portland. Usually, after yet another unresponsive teenager started coming to meetings voluntarily. That evening, he sat down in the guardhouse and opened his journal. In the margins, next to the entry for cell 3-G, he wrote, Wurm, aquatic creature, dry cell. Key image, a pond in the north. Reacts to water. Contact established. In 5 days, Daniel established contact with the thirsty worm using water and conversation. For the first time in 200 years, the worm pressed its snout against the bars. Captain Holloway noticed that Daniel's rounds were taking a suspiciously long time. Morley witnessed changes in cell 3G. The second week of duty began with Daniel stealing a pillow, or rather, borrowing one. In the guard room on first round lay some old mattresses that had been decommissioned about 10 years ago. He took one at night, cut it into pieces, ended up with 6 pillows. Small, hard, but they were pillows. He distributed them among the cells that responded to him. 6 cells. Cell 3G received a pillow first. Wurm sniffed it with his 3 nostrils. Then he rested his snout on it. The sound he made was like a purr. If a quarry could purr. Cell 3D received the second pillow. The prisoner inside still hadn't emerged from the darkness, but he took the pillow. In the morning, it was lying not by the bars, but deep inside the cell. So he'd taken it. That was progress. Cell 3K belonged to a creature listed in the logbook as Ashtray, a mid-ranking fire demon. 400 years of imprisonment. Pepelnik set the pillow on fire. Daniel watched as the stuffing turned to ash. Then he nodded and said he understood. Tomorrow he'd bring something non-flammable. Pepelnik snorted. It was the first sound he'd made in the guard's presence in 40 years. That was progress too. On the 9th day, Daniel discovered a problem. His notes in the margins of the journal already filled 3 pages. If one of his superiors read them, he wouldn't just get a reprimand. He'd be suspended. He might even be imprisoned. Communicating with prisoners was a violation of the code of conduct that was classified as treason. Not just a technical violation, but actual treason. At Anhelm, 3 guards had been executed for this over the past 100 years. Executed for talking. Daniel tore out the filled-in margins. He burned them in a torch. Then he thought he needed his own journal, a separate one, a secret one that no one would find. In Portland, every social worker had a work notebook, records about their clients, dynamics, triggers, progress. Without such a notebook, working was like flying blind. He found a solution on the 10th day. In the storage room, along with the mattresses, lay old forms, blank sheets for reports that no one had used because reports were written in journals. He took a stack, folded them in half, stitched them together with coarse thread from chainmail. The result was a notebook, ugly, thick, but functional. He began to take notes. Cell 3A, unknown, no reaction, complete silence, either unconscious or dead, check. Cell 3B, unknown, breathing audible, moves away when approached, fear. Cell 3B, unknown, hissing, aggression, do not approach the bars closer than a meter. Cell 3G, thirsty worm. Contact established, aquatic creature. Key image, a pond. Reacts to water and a calm voice. Avoids sudden movements. Flattens its ears at sudden gestures. Possible injury related to physical abuse by security. Camera 3D, unknown. Does not emerge from the darkness. Took the pillow. Listens. Does not respond. A wait-and-see approach. He wrote 20 pages in 2 evenings, 40 cameras. Each has its own profile. Some are aggressive. Some is silent. Someone cries at night and falls quiet when they hear footsteps. 2 of them communicate with each other through the wall. They knock. He hasn't figured out the code yet, but he's written down the rhythm of the knocks. One prisoner from cell 3R sang every morning, quietly, in a language Daniel didn't know. The melody was simple and repetitive, a lullaby. Someone deep inside the prison, where there were neither children nor dawn, sang a lullaby every morning. Daniel wrote this down and underlined it. He needed to find out who was in 3R and to whom the song was addressed. On the 11th day, what he had been waiting for and dreading happened. Jeon Haewon came to see him, a junior guard, the only woman in the Anhelm Guard. She'd ended up here under the quota for the Daughters of Heroes. Her ancestor had been one of the paladins of the War of the Seals. Haewon was 24. She was a head taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders. Her uniform fit her perfectly because she'd tailored it herself. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was stern. Her eyes were fierce. She stopped in the doorway of the guardhouse and said she'd heard about him, the newcomer who talks to the creatures. She used that exact word, creatures. Daniel replied that he was talking to inmates. Haewon scowled. She said it was the same thing. She said he was violating the code. She said that if he didn't stop, she'd file a report with Holloway. Daniel looked at her and saw a familiar type, a girl who had spent her whole life proved she was worthy, who had memorized the rules because the rules were the only place where it was clearly written what to do. If you follow the rules, you won't be blamed. If you follow the rules, you're safe. He'd seen people like that in Portland, young guards who yelled at the inmates the loudest because they were trembling with fear inside. He didn't argue. He said he'd heard her. He said maybe she was right. He said he was new and didn't know much. He asked her to explain the rules to him in more detail if she had time. Haewon blinked. She was bracing herself for an argument, for a confrontation, for either defiance or cowardice. Instead, she received a polite request for help. It threw her off balance. She said she'd think about it and left. On the 12th day, she came back. She sat down across from him. She took out her copy of the charter, worn and dog-eared, and began to explain, paragraph by paragraph. Daniel listened. He listened intently, not just for show. The Anhelm Charter was a 300-page document. It had been written 200 years ago and hadn't been updated since. Half the paragraphs contradicted the other half. Some provisions were physically impossible to carry out. For example, paragraph 47 required a monthly inspection of the chambers in the lower circles, but paragraph 83 prohibited descending below the fifth circle without written permission from the conclave, which hadn't been issued since the last century. Daniel listened, nodded, and asked questions. "Huh," one answered. At first, she was curt. Then she grew irritated by the contradictions in the charter that she noticed along with him. By the end of the second hour, she said that paragraph 205 was completely nonsensical. Daniel agreed. Hei-wan looked at him suspiciously. She asked why he wanted to know this. He told her the truth. He said he wanted to know the rules so he could understand which ones protected people and which ones were simply left in place out of habit. Hei-wan stood up and left without saying a word, but she left the charter on the table. On the 13th day, Daniel requested access to the archives for the first time. He went to Morley and said he needed to read the files on the inmates in his section. Morley asked why. Daniel replied in a bureaucratic tone. He said that in order to properly perform his duties, he needed to know each inmate's threat classification so he could prioritize his rounds correctly. Morley looked at him for 5 seconds. Then he said the archives were on the first floor, accessible with a pass issued by the captain. Daniel went to see Holloway. Holloway was sitting in an office that was slightly larger than the guardroom, but furnished with a certain air of orderliness. A map of Anhelm hung on the wall, all 12 circles. For the first time, Daniel saw the entire prison and, for a second, forgot why he had come. It was colossal. 12 circles descending like a giant funnel. Each successive circle was smaller than the one before it. At the very bottom was a tiny dot, the 12th circle, a single cell. He tore his gaze away from the map. Holloway was watching him. Daniel explained his request. Holloway was silent for a minute. Then he said that junior guards never request access to the archives. Never. In his 30 years of service, this was the first time. Daniel replied that he wanted to do his job well. Holloway took a pass out of the drawer. He placed it on the table. He said the archive was open from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Removing documents was prohibited. Daniel took the pass. He thanked him. He left. Behind his back, Holloway took a blank sheet of paper out of the drawer. He wanted to write a report on his subordinate's strange behavior. He held the pen over the paper. He remembered Morley's morning report. The statistics on third circle incidents over the past 2 weeks. 0. For the first time in 10 years, 0. Holloway put the sheet back in the drawer. Daniel began keeping a secret journal of his observations of the prisoners. He distributed pillows to the cells. He met Jun Hei-wan, who at first threatened to file a report, but then left him her handbook. He gained access to the archive through Captain Holloway. The incident statistics for the third circle showed 0 for the first time in 10 years. The Anhelm archive occupied the entire eastern sector of the first circle. It was a cave converted into a library. The ceilings were high, the bookshelves were wooden, some had warped with age. It smelled of dust and something sour, old paper, old ink, and old, forgotten truth. Daniel entered at 6 in the morning. The archivist was an old man in his 70s with eyes faded to transparency. He looked at the pass. He looked at Daniel. He asked what he wanted. Daniel said he was looking for the files of the third circle prisoners. The old man pointed to a distant shelf and lost interest in him. Daniel walked over to the shelf. The files were thick, leather folders bound with ribbon. Each bore the conclave's seal. He took the first one, Cell 3A. He opened it. Name, race, date of incarceration, sentence, list of crimes, judge's signature. Everything was in order. He took the second one, Cell 3B. Same thing. Standard procedure, names, dates, crimes. He read for an hour, then 2. By the end of the third hour, he had read 20 cases and a picture was beginning to form in his mind. One he didn't like. Of the 20 cases, 14 looked normal. Sentence, crime, witnesses, everything made sense. 6 cases were strange, not because there was anything extra in them, because something was missing. Cell 3D. An unnamed prisoner. Race not specified. Date of imprisonment, 300 years ago. Crime, one word, heresy. No description, no witnesses, no interrogation, just heresy. And a signature. By decision of the conclave. Cell 3R. The very same man who sang the lullaby. Name, Terrence May. Human. Date of imprisonment, 120 years ago. The crime? 2 words. Forbidden magic. No description, no witnesses. By decision of the conclave. Daniel closed the folder, set it on the table, rubbed his eyes. He knew what cases looked like when they were fabricated to put a person behind bars. He'd seen them in Portland. When a prosecutor wants a result, not justice, the case becomes thin, the details disappear from it. What remains is the wording. Broad, vague, the kind into which you can fit anything. Heresy, forbidden magic. Trap wording. You can lock up anyone here for anything. He returned to the bookshelf. He began looking through cases from other circles. The second circle. He pulled one out at random, opened it. Sister Irene Vile. A human, a healer. Date of imprisonment, 8 years ago. Crime? Refusal to fulfill the sacred duty of healing. Daniel read the details. There weren't many. The healer had refused to treat the cardinal because there was a pregnant peasant woman in critical condition before her. A priority based on medical ethics. The patient in the worst condition comes first. The cardinal could wait. The peasant woman could not. Irene chose the peasant woman. The cardinal survived. The peasant woman survived. Irene received 8 years in solitary confinement for refusing to fulfill her sacred duty. Daniel closed the case. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from anger. Controlled, quiet, professional anger. He knew that anger. It surfaced every time he read a case file and realized that the system had worked not to protect people, but to protect the system itself. He dug deeper. The fourth circle. The bookshelf against the far wall. The dust was thicker here. These files hadn't been opened in a long time. He found the case he was looking for without knowing what he was looking for. Eleanor Findariel, an elf, court historian. Date of conviction, 312 years ago. Crime, spreading false history. Details. She wrote a book offering an alternative interpretation of the War of the Seals. She cast doubt on the official version of events. The book was confiscated and destroyed. The author was imprisoned in Anhelm, by decision of the conclave. Daniel looked at the file. A historian, imprisoned for a book, 300 years ago, and she's still in there. He returned to the second circle shelving unit. He began checking the files one by one. Of the 15 second circle files, 4 lacked a verdict in the usual sense, only a decision by the conclave. No trial, no witnesses, no charge of a specific crime. He memorized the names. It was dangerous to write them down here. The archivist might have seen him. He memorized 4 names and 4 cell numbers. Then he carefully returned all the folders to their places. He left the archive. He returned to the guardhouse. He took out his notebook. He wrote them down from memory. 4 names, 4 numbers, and 1 phrase. By decision of the conclave, without a trial. This was in the 3rd chapter of his new life. He didn't yet know that the archives concealed things far worse than mere fabricated cases. But he knew one thing. He knew how to read case files. And when something is missing from a file, it says more about the system than anything written in it. That evening he went down for his rounds. Cell 3G Wurm was waiting for him. He was lying by the bars. The bucket of water that Daniel had brought that morning was empty. Daniel sat down. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd been reading the case files today. He said that Wurm's file stated he had destroyed a village on the northern coast. He asked if that was true. Wurm was silent for a long time. Then he answered. He said the village had been his, that the people had come later. They'd built houses on the shore of his pond. He'd put up with them for 40 years. Then they poisoned the water. He destroyed the village, not the people, the houses. The people had fled. He burned the empty walls, because they stood on his shore. That wasn't in the file. The case file stated destruction of a settlement, without specifying that the settlement was empty. Daniel nodded. He jotted it down in his notebook. Destruction of an empty settlement. People evacuated. Motive, territorial defense. Threat status requires review. He understood that this meant nothing, that his notebook had no legal weight, that he was a junior security guard with no say, that these notes could cost him his life. But he also understood something else. Every case he read, every story he recorded, every inconsistency he found, it was a brick. One brick meant nothing, but walls are built brick by brick. In Portland, he spent 7 years compiling documentation on a single teenager whom the system wanted to send to an adult prison. 7 years of notes, 7 years of reports, 7 years of a quiet bureaucratic war. In the 8th year, the judge read the file and overturned the decision. The teenager went to college. Daniel knew how to wait, and he knew how to take notes. Before going to sleep, he reread his notebook. 30 pages, 40 cells in the 3rd circle, 4 suspicious cases in the 2nd circle, 1 case in the 4th circle, and the question he'd written on the last page. If the verdicts in the upper circles are false, what about those in the lower ones? Daniel began working in the archives. He discovered that 6 cases in circle and 4 cases from the 2nd circle did not contain the actual verdicts. He found the cases of Irene Weil and Eleanor Findariel. He learned the true story of Wurm and recorded the first discrepancy between the case file and reality. He began keeping a secret notebook with documentation. The first month in Anhelm ended with Daniel stopped sleeping. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't have time. The day was divided into 3 parts: rounds, the archives, and record keeping. Rounds took 4 hours, 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening. He went through all 40 cells. He sat down at each one where there was contact. He spoke. He listened. He sat silently nearby if the prisoner didn't want to talk. By the end of the month, out of 40 cells, 12 responded to him. 7 talked. 2 waited for his rounds. 1, cell 3-R, Terrence May, stopped singing his lullaby only in the mornings and began singing when he heard Daniel's footsteps. It wasn't joy. It was recognition. Someone is coming. A specific someone. Not faceless boots, but a person. The archives took 3 hours a day. Daniel read the case files, systematically, round after round. He had completed the 3rd round in its entirety. Of the 40 inmates, 28 had standard files with sentences and descriptions of their crimes. 12 were questionable. 6 had no sentence. 6 had sentences so vague that they could apply to anyone. The 2nd round, 20 cells. Of those, 7 were questionable. 4 had no sentence. 3 were worded according to the conclave's decision. 4th round, 30 cells. Access to the case files was restricted. He read 10 out of 30 before the archivist said the rest were in a restricted section. Special permission was required. Of the 10 he'd read, 3 were suspicious, including the case of Eleanor Findariel. The records took the rest of the night. The notebook swelled. He started a 2nd one. He hid them under a stone slab in the guardhouse. The slab was loose and lifted easily. There was a gap the width of a palm beneath it. Both notebooks fit in there. One night, while he was writing, Heywan entered the guardhouse, without knocking. Daniel barely had time to close the notebook. Heywan sat down across from him, silently, for a long time. Then she said she'd been watching him for the past 2 weeks, that she'd walked past cell 3G 7 times while on other guards' rounds, that Wurm hadn't moved a muscle in her presence. He lay with his snout facing the hallway, calm. That in the entire history of Anhelm, not a single guard had ever achieved such a result with a class devourer like Wurm. Daniel remained silent. Heywan said she wouldn't file a report. Daniel nodded. Heywan said she didn't approve of his methods. Daniel nodded again. Heywan said, "But and fell silent for 10 seconds. Then she said that in cell 3, F was a prisoner she feared more than any other. A shadow named Grieve. He doesn't attack. He doesn't growl. He doesn't break the bars. He whispers every time a guard walks by. The whisper gets inside your head. After hearing Grieve's whispers, 2 guards requested a transfer last year. 1 quit the force altogether. Hawan walks past cell 3F, holding her breath, every time, twice a day. She asked if Daniel could do anything about it. Daniel looked at her, a 24-year-old woman in a uniform that's too big for her, in more ways than one, who holds her breath as she walks past the cell because she's afraid. And she came to him, to the rookie she'd looked down on just 2 weeks ago, because there was no one else to turn to. He said he'd try. In the morning, he approached cell 3F. The whispering began immediately. Quiet, as if someone were speaking right inside his skull. The words were indistinct, but the sensation was clear. Cold. Despair. The feeling that everything was meaningless and had always been meaningless. Daniel recognized that feeling. He'd dealt with it before. In Portland, there had been a teenager who cut his wrists while saying things that made grown men walk out of the room. Not threats, the truth. The kind of truth that's impossible to bear. The teenager projected his pain outward because he couldn't keep it inside. Grieve was doing the same thing. Only his pain was older, deeper, and it had a magical frequency that resonated in the listener's brain. Daniel sat down by the camera. The whispering grew louder. His head began to buzz. His vision darkened. He clenched his teeth. He focused. He began to breathe as he'd been taught in crisis intervention training. Steady, deep, through his diaphragm. The whisper was pressing in. He spoke up, loudly, not shouting over the whisper, but weaving his voice into it. He said he could hear it. He said he understood that it hurt. He said he wouldn't leave. The whisper faltered. For a second. Then it returned, but quieter. Daniel kept talking, in an even voice, without breaking, without fear. Just as he'd spoken to that teenager. Just as he'd spoken to the woman standing on the bridge at 3 in the morning. Just as he'd spoken to the old man who hadn't spoken for 3 years after his release from prison. With a voice that neither imposes itself nor fawns. A voice that simply says, "I'm here. I hear you. I'm not leaving." 20 minutes later, the whispering subsided. It didn't stop completely. It subsided. It became background noise. A voice came from the darkness of the cell. Not a whisper. A voice. Hoarse. Grieve asked why he had come. Daniel replied that he'd been asked to. Grieve asked who. Daniel said he couldn't give a name, but this man walks past the cell twice a day, and every time he holds his breath. Grieve was silent. Then he said he didn't know, that he didn't want to, that he couldn't stop the whispering. It wasn't a spell. It was him, his very essence. He radiated pain the way a furnace radiates heat, not by choice. Daniel nodded. He asked how long Grieve had been in the cell. 400 years. He asked if he had whispered before the cell. Grieve fell silent for a long time. Then he said no, that he used to be quiet, that the whispering began in the cell, in the 3rd year, because of the silence. Daniel wrote this down in his notebook that evening. Grieve. A shadow. Whispering is a projection of isolation trauma, not an innate ability, acquired in the cell. 400 years of unbroken solitude had turned a quiet creature into a source of pain. He showed Hawan the entry, not the notebook, just that one page. She read it. She looked up. There was something new in her eyes. Not anger, not suspicion, confusion. She said that meant Anhelm had made him that way. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. She figured it out on her own. The next morning, Hawan walked past cell 3F without holding her breath. The whispering was still there, but she knew now that it wasn't a weapon. It was a scream. On the 25th day, Morley came to see Daniel. He closed the guardroom door. He sat down. His face was heavy. He said that Captain Holloway had requested statistics on all circles for the past month. Circle 3 had shown the best results in 10 years. 0 incidents, 0 escape attempts, 0 cases of aggression during patrols. Morley said that was impossible. That Circle 3 had always been problematic. That Wurm alone accounted for 2 incidents a month. Daniel said nothing. Morley leaned closer. He spoke quietly. He doesn't know what Daniel is doing. He doesn't want to know. But he said that if Holloway starts digging, he'll find out. Because Holloway always finds out. And then things will get ugly. Not a reprimand, not a ration cut, a trial. Daniel thanked him for the warning. Morley stood up. At the door, he turned around. He said that Wurm had yawned in front of him that morning, calmly, like a cat. For 20 years, Morley had only ever seen Wurm snarl. Morley shook his head and left. Daniel was left alone. He took out his notebook. He opened the last page. He reread his question. If the verdicts in the upper circles, the verdicts are false, then what about those in the lower circles? He wrote a new question beneath it. How to gain access to the archives of the lower circles. He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew he'd find it, because that's his job. Not a halberd, not chainmail, not runic seals or paragraphs of the charter. His job is to open cases, to read, listen, take notes, and ask questions that no one had asked in 200 years. The notebook closed. The slab returned to its place. The corridor of the third circle was quiet. But this was a different kind of silence. Not dead, alive. A silence in which someone was waiting for morning. Daniel took stock of the first month. 12 out of 40 cells responded to him. In the archives, he found a wealth of suspicious cases without actual convictions. Hawan asked him to help with grieve and learned that the demon's whispering was the result of solitary confinement, not an innate ability. Morley warned that Holloway would start digging sooner or later. The statistics for the third circle were the best in 10 years. On the 30th day, Daniel descended to the fifth circle. Not of his own free will, Morley woke him up 2 hours before his shift and said that Captain Holloway had ordered Junior Shaw to accompany Senior Guard Brennan on an inspection of the fifth circle. Brennan had fallen ill. A second guard was needed. Daniel pulled on his chainmail. He grabbed his halberd. He made his way up to the meeting point by the stairs on the fourth circle. There, waiting for him, was a man he'd only ever seen from a distance before. Senior Guard Thomas Brennan. A large man, taciturn, with a face that looked as if its owner had never smiled since birth. Brennan looked down at Daniel. He said they'd move quickly. No stopping, no looking at the cameras, no listening. The fifth circle is home to those from whom even the walls turn away. Daniel nodded. They went down. The fourth circle was similar to the third. Darker, colder, fewer torches, thicker bars. The runes on the bars burned brighter. Here sat those whose power required a stronger seal. Daniel counted the cells. 30. Some radiated heat, others cold. From one came singing. Quiet, beautiful, unbearably beautiful. Brennan quickened his pace. He told Daniel not to listen, that it was a trap. The voice was luring him in. Daniel stopped listening to the melody, but he memorized the cell number, 4L. The fifth circle greeted them with a smell. Dampness, rot, something metallic, like old blood. The corridor was already there. The ceiling was lower. Torches burned every 3 paces. Most of the corridor was shrouded in darkness. The bars weren't made of black metal, but of something else, white, bone-like. Brennan said it was a rune bone,
an alloy of the bones of fallen paladins and holy steel, the only material capable of holding the prisoners of the fifth circle. Daniel looked at the bars.
Human bones used as prison bars. He thought that the most terrifying thing in Portland was when a teenager was sent to an adult prison. Here, the level of horror was several orders of magnitude higher. But the mechanics were the same. The system uses people as raw material. The inspection was a formality. Brennan walked down the corridor. He peered into the cells. He made notes on his tablet. Alive, alive, inactive, alive, asleep, alive, status unclear. 20 cells in 40 minutes. Not a single word to the inmates, not a single question. A livestock count. Daniel followed behind him and memorized everything. Cell 5A. Something huge curled into a ring, not moving. Cell 5G. Empty. Brennan wrote alive, but Daniel didn't see anyone in the cell. Cell 5K. A human-like creature, sitting in the corner, arms wrapped around its knees, rocking back and forth. Cell 5M. A man was standing by the bars, straight-backed, tall, wearing armor that was once white but has now turned gray with age. His eyes were open. He was looking straight ahead, not at the guards, but right through them. Brennan walked past. Daniel stopped for a second and looked at the camera label. 5M. The name? Silvar Kholodny. Something stirred in his memory. He'd seen that name in the archives, just a glimpse, on a page he hadn't had time to read. Brennan turned around and barked at Daniel to keep up. Daniel caught up with him, but he remembered the name. Silvar Kholodny, Cell 5M. They finished the inspection and headed back up. On the staircase between the fourth and third circles, Daniel asked Brennan who Silvar Kholodny was. Brennan stopped. He looked at him. His face hardened. He said that Silvar Kholodny was the former commander of the Paladins of the Silver Order, a hero of the Third Siege of Anhelm, imprisoned 200 years ago for treason, the most dangerous prisoner in the Fifth Circle. Daniel asked what the treason consisted of. Brennan said it was none of his business. He turned around and walked away. Daniel returned to the guardhouse. He took out his notebook. He wrote down everything he remembered from the Fifth Circle. 20 cells, 20 profiles, a rough sketch. Then he went to the archives. The archivist was already used to him. He nodded. Daniel found the shelf for the Fifth Circle. The files were thinner than those from the Third Circle. Some folders contained only 2 sheets, name, sentence, signature. That was it. He found the file on Silvar the Cold. He opened it. Silvar Atos, nickname, the Cold. Race, human. Age at the time of imprisonment, 52 years. Branch of service, Silver Order. Rank, commander. Crime, treason against the Conclave and the Light Coalition. Date of imprisonment, 214 years ago. Sentence, life imprisonment. Signed by decision of the Conclave. 2 pages. For a commander of paladins, a hero of the siege. 2 pages. No description of the treason. No witnesses. No interrogation transcript. Daniel flipped through the folder. Empty. But between the second and third pages, he noticed something. Glue. Old. Dried out. There had been other pages here. They'd been torn out. Neatly. Professionally. But the glue remained. Someone had once pasted documents into this file, then removed them. Daniel put the folder back in its place. His hands didn't tremble. He was calm. This wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. The system didn't just imprison people without a trial. It also destroyed evidence. In Portland, things like this meant that someone at the top was afraid of the truth. Here it meant the same thing, only here it wasn't a prosecutor sitting at the top. It was the Conclave. That evening, he made his rounds through the Third Circle. He sat down by cell 3G as usual. Wurm was lying by the bars, calm. A bucket of water stood in the corner. Daniel brought a fresh one. He set it down beside it. He sat down. And for the first time in a month, he didn't speak first. He just sat there. Wurm looked at him with his 6 eyes. Then he quietly asked what had happened. Daniel was surprised, not because Wurm had spoken first, that had been happening for a week now, but because Wurm had noticed his state of mind. A 200-year-old demon devourer in a stone cell had read from the young guard's face that he was upset. Daniel said he'd been to the 5th circle, that he'd seen a man there in white armor, who stands and looks right through the walls. Wurm made a sound, a low, short sound. He said he knew who it was. Silvar, the commander. They remember him even here, even 2 circles away. Wurm said that Silvar had come to Anhelm even before he became a prisoner.
He came as an inspector. He talked to them, not like Daniel. But he did talk. He asked questions. He listened. Then he stopped coming. Then he showed up downstairs, behind bars. Wurm fell silent. Daniel jotted this down in his notebook. Silvar had talked to the prisoners before his arrest. Then they locked him up. Correlation. He talked, and he was locked up. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the stone. He was doing the same thing Silvar had done. Talking, listening, taking notes. And Silvar has been behind bars for 200 years. Daniel closed his notebook. He tucked it under the stove. He lay down on the cot. He didn't fall asleep until morning. For the first time, Daniel went down to the 5th circle and saw Silvar the Cold, the former commander of the Paladins, imprisoned for treason. In the archives, he discovered that pages had been torn from Silvar's case file. He learned from Wurm that Silvar, before his arrest, had also talked to the prisoners. He realized he was repeating the path that had led Silvar to his cell. On the 35th day, Daniel made a decision. He would go to Silvar. Not on an inspection, not with an escort. Alone. This was a violation of 7 paragraphs of the regulations. A junior guard was not allowed to leave his post without orders. He was not allowed to go down below without an escort. He was not allowed to approach inmates in another section. Each paragraph carried a punishment ranging from flogging to a court-martial. Daniel knew the regulations. Hawan had explained them to him line by line. He knew the risk. He went anyway. He chose the time between the night and morning shifts, the dead of night. The torchbearers had already passed. The guards were changing shifts. The corridors were empty. He descended the stairs to the 4th circle, quietly, quickly, past the cells without stopping. There was a guard post on the staircase between the 4th and 5th circles. A barred gate with a lock. Daniel took out a set of keys. Morley kept a spare set in the guardhouse. The 3rd key worked. The grate opened. The 5th circle looked different at night. The torches weren't lit. The darkness was complete, absolute. Daniel walked by memory. He counted his steps. 20 to the first turn, 30 to the 2nd. Cell 5M was the 13th on the right. He found it by touch. The bone bars were smooth and warm under his fingers. He sat down on the floor. The stone here was colder than on the 3rd circle. Damp. Not a sound came from the cell. Daniel spoke, quietly. He said his name was Dan, that he was a guard on the 3rd circle, that he'd come without permission, that he'd read Silvar's case file, that the case was empty. 2 pages, that someone had torn out the rest. Silence. He continued. He said he knew about the Silver Order, that Silvar was the commander, that before his arrest he had spoken with the prisoners at Anhelm, that then they had put him in jail. Silence. Daniel took a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket. He'd found it in the archives, an old record, a list of Silver Order officers from a year before Silvar's arrest. Next to Silvar's name was another, Mera Atos, his wife. Daniel said the name aloud. Mera. A sound echoed through the cell. Metal against stone. Armor. Movement. Then a voice, steady, muffled, as if a wall were speaking. Silvar asked how he knew that name. Daniel said from the archives, from the Silver Order list. Silvar was silent. Then he asked if she was alive. Daniel said he didn't know, that he'd check. Silvar was silent again.
Daniel waited. 7 minutes. Then Silvar spoke. He spoke slowly. The words came with difficulty. 200 years of silence had eaten away at his voice like rust. He said he had commanded an inspection of the lower circles, that he had seen things he wasn't supposed to see, that he had written a report. The report went up the chain, to the conclave. A week later, they came for him. He was charged with treason. They took his armor. They imprisoned him. His wife, Mara, she was transferred from Angelma that same day. He doesn't know where. He hasn't known for 200 years. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. When Silvar fell silent, Daniel said 2 things. First, he would find out where Mara had been taken. Second, Silvar's report. What was in it? What he saw in the lower circles. Silvar didn't answer right away. Then he said one word. Empty cells. Empty cells in the lower circles. He went down to the 10th circle. According to the records, the 10th circle held 20 prisoners classified as the highest security risk. In reality, it was empty. 20 cells, 0 prisoners. The seals had been broken. The doors were open. Someone had let them out. Or they'd left on their own. 200 years ago. Daniel felt the floor shift beneath him. 20 highest-risk creatures on the loose. 200 years, and no one knows. He thanked Silvar. He stood up. On stiff legs, he walked back down the corridor. He climbed the stairs. He locked the grate. He returned to the guard room. He sat down. He opened his notebook. His hands were shaking for the first time in his entire new life. He wrote it down. The 10th circle. Empty cells. 20 prisoners disappeared 200 years ago. The conclave knows. Silvar wrote a report and was imprisoned. The report was destroyed. The one who guards the demons no longer guards them. This isn't a prison. It's a theater. In the morning, he went on his rounds, cell after cell. He smiled. He spoke. He listened. He brought water to Wurm. He checked the pillows. He noted their progress in his notebook. 12 are responding. The 14th has started to react to his voice. The 15th no longer hisses. He was doing his job, just as he'd done it in Portland when he knew the system was rotten, but the people in front of him were real. The system can wait. People come first. At noon, Heywan came to see him. Her face was tense. She said an inspection team had arrived from above, from the Holy See. 3 people, dressed in conclave robes. They're going around in circles, checking things out. They're asking questions. Heywan said that one of them asked about the junior security guard, Sho, specifically, by name. Daniel asked what exactly they'd asked. Heywan said they were interested in why the statistics for the 3rd circle had improved so dramatically. Who's in charge of the section? How old he was? How long he'd been on the job? Daniel nodded. He put the notebook under the stove. He checked to make sure the stove was level. He went out. He ran into the inspection team in the 4th circle hallway. 3 men in white robes with gold embroidery. The eldest of them was short and stocky, with a good-natured face like that of an uncle at a holiday fair. His eyes were small and attentive. He introduced himself as Secretary Lorenz, assistant to Cardinal Kane. It was the first time Daniel had heard that name. Kane. The name meant nothing to him. Yet. Lorenz spoke softly. He praised the guard's work. He marveled at the statistics. He asked Daniel how he managed to maintain order in the 3rd circle. Daniel replied in a bureaucratic manner. A systematic approach, regular patrols, schedule monitoring. Lorenz smiled. He said that young guards were rarely so responsible. He said that Cardinal Kane would be pleased to hear about such talent. Perhaps it was worth considering a transfer to the higher-ups, to the Holy See, to an administrative position. Daniel smiled in response. He thanked him for his consideration. He said he liked working on the 3rd circuit, that he'd like to stay. Lorenz nodded. He didn't stop smiling. He left. Daniel stood in the hallway and thought, a transfer to a higher position. That's not a reward, it's isolation. Taking him away from the unit, cutting him off from the inmates, cutting him off from the notebooks, cutting him off from everything he'd been building for a month. He returned to the guardhouse. Ha-Won was waiting for him. He told her that the conclave wanted to transfer him. Ha-Won said nothing. Then she said one word. Bad. Daniel secretly went down to see Silvar and learned that the 10th circle was empty. 20 prisoners of the highest category had disappeared 200 years ago. Silvar had been imprisoned for reporting this. An inspection team led by Cardinal Kane had arrived from the Holy See. Secretary Lorenz offered Daniel a transfer to the upper levels, which effectively meant removal from working with prisoners. Daniel spent 2 days mulling over the situation. The transfer order from above could arrive at any moment. He couldn't stop it. A junior guard had no right to refuse an order from the conclave. But he could make the transfer unappealing. He needed protection, not a sword or a spell. He needed results, so obvious, so measurable, and so valuable that removing him from the unit would mean harming Anhelm itself. He'd once found himself in a similar situation in Portland. His new boss had wanted to fire him. In 2 months, Daniel had led his team of inmates to the best performance metrics in the state. Recidivism had dropped by 40%. The boss couldn't touch him because the numbers spoke louder than personal animosity. Daniel had started with Wurm. In 5 weeks, Wurm had gone from being the most problematic inmate in the 3rd circle to the calmest. But only Morley and Daniel knew this. Everyone needed to know. He went to see Holloway. He sat down in his office. He said he wanted to propose a pilot program. He called it the Behavioral Stability Assessment. The idea was simple. Every inmate would receive a weekly assessment based on 3 criteria: aggression, social interaction, behavioral predictability. Daniel would keep the records. Morley would certify them. Holloway would sign off on them. In 3 months, they'd have data they could present to the higher-ups. Not words, data. Holloway listened. His expression didn't change. When Daniel finished, the captain was silent for a minute. Then he asked why he needed this. Daniel said that the best defense against questions from above was answers in the form of numbers. Holloway narrowed his eyes. He understood. Not everything, but he understood that the kid wasn't just talking to demons. He was building a system. Holloway said he'd think about it. 2 days later, he summoned Daniel and told him the project had been approved, unofficially, without the conclave seal, as an internal initiative of the Guard. Daniel got to work. Every evening he compiled a report. Cell, inmate, behavior for the week, trends, recommendations. The reports were dry, bureaucratic, perfect. No mention of conversations, no names, only cell numbers and figures. During those same days, something happened with Ha-Won. She began to linger by the cells on her rounds. Not for long, just 5 seconds longer than before. Daniel noticed this on the 3rd day. She was standing by cell 3F, by Greaves' cell, without holding her breath. A whisper could be heard. She listened. Then she moved on. That evening she came to the guard post. She said that Greaves had been whispering more quietly today. Daniel nodded. He said he knew. That Greaves had been whispering more quietly every day for the past week, ever since he found out that his whispering frightened living people. Ha-Won sat down. She was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question Daniel had been waiting for since day 1. She asked how he did it. How he managed to get a demon who had been radiating pain for 400 years to suddenly start holding back. Daniel answered simply. He said that Greaves didn't know his whispers caused others pain. When he found out, he felt ashamed. Shame isn't a weakness. Shame is a sign that a being cares. If he cares, then he can be worked with. Ha-Won looked at him. Then she said that at the Guardians Academy, they were taught that demons don't care, that they have no conscience, that they are machines of destruction. Daniel asked if she had known even one demon personally before Angelma. Ha-Won said no. Daniel asked how many of her instructors at the academy had worked at Angelma. Hawan thought for a moment. She said none. Daniel spread his arms. Hawan stood up. She left. She returned an hour later with 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of Daniel. They sat down. They were silent. They drank tea. It was the first evening they'd simply sat side by side without arguing or asking questions. Daniel thought that in Portland, a partner needed exactly the same amount of time. A month of conflict, 1 honest conversation, and a mug of tea. On the 42nd day, something happened that he hadn't expected. He came to the archives as usual. The archivist nodded. Daniel walked over to the shelves and stopped. The 4th circle shelf was empty, completely. The 30 folders that had been there yesterday were gone. He approached the archivist. He asked where the files from the 4th circle were. The old man looked at him with faded eyes. He said he didn't know. That people from the Holy See had come that morning, they'd taken them. They said it was for an audit. No, they didn't leave a receipt. No, he didn't remember their names. Daniel returned to the empty shelf. He stood there, staring at the spot where 30 lives had once lain. 30 cases, 30 stories, 10 of which he'd managed to read and transcribe. 20 he hadn't had time for. Now they were upstairs, in the hands of people who had no need for the truth. He left the archive. He went down to the 3rd circle. He made his rounds. Wurm was waiting for him. Daniel sat down. He brought some water. He didn't speak. Wurm didn't ask. He just lay there next to the bars. Sometimes that's enough. On the 44th day, Daniel asked Holloway for a meeting. He closed the office door. He said that the files from the 4th circle had been taken. Holloway knew. He said it was standard procedure. The conclave has the right to seize any documents. Daniel asked if the captain had ever seen them returned. Holloway didn't answer. Daniel asked something else. He asked if the captain knew who was in cell 4L. Holloway tensed up. Cell 4L. The one where they were singing. The captain said there was a prisoner there. A woman. The case is classified. He didn't know anything else. Daniel said that this case had been in the seized files. And now it's gone. Neither in the archives nor in his memory. Only Daniel had managed to write down the cell number. Holloway was silent for a long time. Then he spoke quietly. He said he'd been serving at Angelmo for 30 years, that he does his job, that he doesn't ask questions, that questions at Angelmo are dangerous. Daniel nodded. He said he knew, that Silvar had asked questions too. Holloway flinched as if struck. He looked at Daniel. His eyes had changed. They were no longer those of a commander. They were human, frightened. He asked how Daniel knew about Silvar. Daniel said he'd spoken with him. Holloway stood up. He paced around the office. He said it was impossible, that Silvar doesn't talk. He's been silent for 200 years. Daniel said he had been silent. Now he's speaking. Holloway stood by the wall. He looked at the map of Angelmo, at the 12 circles, at the tiny dot at the bottom. Then he turned and said one sentence. He said that Holloway's great-grandfather had served in Angelmo, that he had been a guard in the 4th circle, that one day he had disappeared. The family received a notice that he had died in the line of duty, but his body was never returned. All his life, Holloway had believed that an inmate had killed his great-grandfather, but now he wasn't sure. Daniel looked at the captain. He said he could check it out, if Holloway would give him a name. Holloway spoke. Corvin Holloway. Daniel nodded. He wrote it down. He left. Daniel launched the inmate behavioral assessment system to protect himself from being reduced to numbers. Hawan began to change her attitude toward the inmates and became his partner over a cup of tea. The 4th circle's files had been removed from the archives by the conclave. Holloway told her about his missing great-grandfather, a guard, and asked Daniel to uncover the truth. The name Corvin Holloway was not found in the Angelma archives. The archives had been wiped clean. The 4th circle files had vanished. The fifth circle files were locked away in a restricted section. Daniel stood with his back against the wall. And then he remembered Eleanor Findari, a historian, fourth circle, 312 years in a cell. He'd managed to read her file before it was seized, but the file itself wasn't important. What mattered was that Eleanor had been a court historian. She knew the archives. She knew the conclave's document management system. She knew where they hid what they didn't want to show. The problem was that Eleanor was in the fourth circle. Daniel had no access there. He'd ended up in the fifth by accident with Brennan. You couldn't even get into the fourth by accident. Security was tight. There were guard posts at every turn. He needed a legitimate reason. He found it through Holloway. He went to the captain and said that to fully assess behavioral stability, a comparison between the circles was necessary. The third circle couldn't be evaluated in a vacuum. A control group was needed. The fourth circle was ideal for comparison. A similar level of danger, a similar structure of content. Holloway listened. Then he asked why Daniel actually needed the fourth circle. Daniel answered honestly. He said there was a historian there, one who could help find information about Corvin Holloway. The captain didn't say a word for 10 seconds. Then he took out a pass with 2 keys. He placed it on the table. He said it was temporary access, 3 days. He couldn't grant any more without a request from higher up. Daniel took the pass. He went down to the fourth circle. During the day, it was open. He walked past the guard post. He showed his pass. The guard at the post looked at Holloway's insignia on the pass and silently let him through. The fourth circle's corridor was wider than the third's. The cells were larger. The bars were made of the same black metal, but the runes on them glowed brighter and were more intricate. Double seals, T in some places. Creatures far more dangerous than Wurm were held here. Cell 4R. He found it at the end of the corridor. It was bright behind the bars, softly so. Inside, a light source that wasn't a torch was glowing. Something resembling a sphere of dim golden radiance. In that light sat a woman, or what looked like a woman. Slender, with long white hair, with a face that looked 25, but eyes that betrayed 3 centuries. Her eyes were old, tired, very intelligent. In front of her lay a stack of some kind of papers. She was writing, in the cell, with something like a piece of charcoal on some kind of surface. Daniel stopped, sat down, introduced himself, said he'd read her case file, that he knew why she'd been imprisoned, that the book had been confiscated. Eleanor looked up. She looked at him. Then she spoke in a voice that sounded like the ringing of thin glass. She said that her case file contained nothing but the verdict, that he could have read only the charges, and the charges weren't a story. Daniel nodded. He said that was exactly why he was there, because he needed a story, not the indictment. Eleanor looked at him. 312 years in a cell. Over the course of 312 years, guards had come to see her. Prison officials, inspectors, once an interrogator. Not once had anyone said they needed a story. Everyone had said they needed silence. She asked what kind of story exactly. Daniel said 2 things. First, he needed to find information about a man named Corvin Holloway, a guard in the fourth circle. He disappeared about 50 years ago. Second, he needed to understand how the Conclave's archives were organized, where they kept what they didn't want to show. Eleanor was silent for a minute. Then she smiled. Her first smile in 300 years looked like a crack in stone. Awkward, almost painful, but genuine. She said that the Conclave's archives had 3 levels. The first level was what Daniel had seen, open shelves, files accessible with a pass. The second level was a restricted section, files kept under lock and key, accessible only to senior Conclave officers and inspectors. The third level was a vault beneath the Holy See. That's where everything the Conclave wants to forget but cannot destroy lies. Because destroying documents requires the consent of all 7 cardinals, and the consent of all 7 has never been reached in 200 years. Daniel listened. He took it all in. He didn't take out his notebook. Not here. Eleanor continued. She said she remembered Corvin Holloway, not personally, but by name. 50 years ago, a rumor spread through the Fourth Circle. A guard found something in one of the prisoners' cells, something that wasn't supposed to be there. A document or an object. The guard reported it to his superiors. 3 days later, the guard disappeared. His cell was sealed off. The prisoner was transferred. To where, no one knew. The case was closed. She didn't remember the guard's name, but the description matched. Daniel asked which prisoner, from which cell. Eleanor said she didn't know the cell number, but she knew the prisoner was from the lower circles. He had been temporarily transferred to the upper levels, to the Fourth Circle for some reason. And that guard, Corvin, had found something on him. Daniel stood up. He thanked her and promised to return tomorrow. Eleanor called him back. She asked if he could bring her some ink, real ink. She was tired of writing with charcoal. 300 years of charcoal. Daniel nodded. That evening, he took out his notebook. He wrote everything down. 3 levels of the archive, the rumor about Corvin, the prisoner transferred from above, a document or object that wasn't supposed to exist. Then he wrote down something else. Eleanor, contact established, willing to talk, needs ink, needs someone to value her knowledge. For 300 years, she'd been writing history with charcoal on stone. For 300 years, no one asked what she was writing. He found some ink in the storeroom, an old bottle, half dried up. He diluted it with water. The next day, he brought it to Eleanor. She took the bottle with both hands. She held it for a long time. She looked at the ink. Then she said quietly that the last time she'd had real ink was 300 years ago, when she was writing her book. Daniel said he'd found something else. He pulled a folder out of his coat pocket, a thin folder, an old one. He'd found it that morning in the farthest corner of the archive, on the bottom shelf, under a stack of blank forms. Someone had hidden it or forgotten it. There was a name on the folder. Eleanor Findariel. Not a case, a book. The manuscript of a confiscated book, undestroyed, forgotten on the bottom shelf. Eleanor stared at the folder, at her name written in her own handwriting 3 centuries ago. Her hands were trembling. She wasn't crying. Elves cry differently, silently, with eyes that grow brighter. Her eyes flashed so brightly that the golden orb in the chamber seemed dim by comparison. Daniel slipped the folder through the slit in the grate. Eleanor took it. She pressed it to her chest, without opening it. She just held it. Daniel said he'd read it, that he wanted her to finish writing the chapter about the war, that they now had a witness. Eleanor looked up. She asked what kind of witness. Daniel said that Lilith Morvain was sitting in the 12th circle, who had been there, who remembers. Eleanor looked at him. Then she said that he was either the bravest man in Angelmo or the craziest. Daniel said he'd been told that before. Daniel gained access to the 4th circle and established contact with Eleanor Findariel. He learned about the 3 levels of the Conclave's archives. Eleanor recalled that Corvin Holloway had disappeared after discovering something on a prisoner. Daniel found and returned Eleanor's confiscated manuscript to her. He told her about Lilith as a witness to the war. On the 50th day, Daniel woke up to a sound he hadn't heard once during his entire time in Angelmo. A bell, deep and resonant, heavy, ringing from above, from the 1st circle. It was an alarm. Morley burst into the guard room. His face was pale. He said there had been an escape. The 7th circle. A prisoner had broken out of his cell. The first escape in 20 years. All of Angelm was on high alert. The guards were being mobilized. Morley shoved a halberd into Daniel's hands and told him to go to the post by the stairs on the 3rd circle. Stand there. Don't let anyone go up or down. Daniel ran. The corridors were noisy. Guards were running past. Shouts. The clang of weapons. Someone was dragging chains. Someone was carrying a shield covered in runes. Daniel reached his post. He stood there, halberd in hand. His grip was wrong. He could hear a rumbling somewhere below. The sound was physical. The walls were vibrating. The floor shook beneath his feet. Something enormous was thrashing below. 10 minutes later, Hawan ran up. She stood beside him. Her halberd was gripped correctly. Her face was focused. She said that a prisoner from the seventh circle had broken free, a creature named Chroma, a devourer of flesh, a different category than the worm. The worm is a devourer of water. Chroma is a devourer in the literal sense, a man-eater. 3 pairs of jaws. He killed 18 paladins during his capture 2,000 years ago. Daniel gripped his halberd. It was pointless. Against a creature that had killed 18 paladins, a halberd was like a toothpick against a bear. But his hands needed something to do. The rumbling below subsided. Then it resumed, closer. Chroma was rising. Hawan said that the guards of the 5th and 6th circles were trying to stop him. 17 people. Daniel thought of the 17 people standing between him and the creature with 3 pairs of jaws. Then he thought of something else. He asked Hawan why Chroma had escaped right now. 20 years without any escapes. Why today? Hawan didn't answer. She didn't know. Daniel thought about Lorenz, about Cardinal Kane's secretary, about his visit a week ago, about how tactfully he'd inquired about Daniel, about how gently he'd offered a transfer, about the 4th circle cases that had vanished from the archives immediately after the visit. There are no coincidences. The prosecutors in Portland had taught him that. When something happens immediately after someone's visit, it's no coincidence. It's cause and effect. The rumbling was getting closer. Now it was coming from the 6th circle. The guards hadn't been able to hold them back. Hawan turned pale, but didn't move from her spot. Daniel made his decision in 3 seconds. He told Hawan to hold her position. He turned around. He ran, not upward, but downward. Hawan shouted after him. He didn't stop. He ran down the stairs of the 3rd circle, past the cameras, past the bars behind which shadows stirred. The prisoners heard the rumbling. They felt the vibration. They knew something was coming from below. Daniel ran to cell 3G. Wurm was standing, not lying down, standing. All 6 eyes glowed brightly. His body was tense. He sensed Chroma. Daniel stopped at the bars. He was breathing heavily. He said a creature was rising from below, a devourer of flesh, that the guards couldn't stop it. Wurm looked at him. Daniel said he wasn't asking Wurm to fight. He wasn't asking for anything, but he was asking. Did Wurm know who Chroma was? Wurm made a sound, deep, guttural. He said he knew. That Chroma had sat next to him on the 7th circle, before Wurm was transferred up to the 3rd, 300 years ago. Daniel asked if Chroma had a weakness. Wurm answered immediately, without a pause. He said that Chroma was afraid of water, a flesh devourer, of the fire type. Water to him was like acid to human skin. It wouldn't kill him, but it would slow him down, blind him, buy some time. Daniel nodded, turned around, ran toward the service cistern. 2 circles up. He knew the way. He went there every morning to get water for Wurm. The cistern stood on the technical level between the 1st and 2nd circles. A stone tank, 10 buckets of water. He turned on the faucet. Water flowed down the chute. The gutter led to the 2nd circle for drainage. Daniel redirected the gutter. He knocked the wooden stopper loose with a stone. The water gushed not toward the 2nd circle, but further on, down the drainage channel. To the 3rd, to the 4th, to the 5th. 10 buckets of water turned into a stream. Not a big one, but enough to flood the 5th circle corridor up to his ankles. Daniel ran back down. On the staircase between the 4th and 5th circles, he ran into the retreating guards. 6 men. 3 were wounded. 1 was unconscious. They were dragging him upstairs. The senior guard shouted that Chroma had breached the barricade. He's heading for the 4th circle. Daniel shouted to them about the water. He told them he'd released water from the cistern, that it was flooding the corridors, that Chroma was afraid of water, that they needed to drive him back into the wet corridor. The senior guard looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he heard a sound from below, a hiss, a roar, the sound of water on a scorching surface. Chroma had reached the wet corridor. The roar grew louder, more ferocious, but it slowed down. The senior guard cursed. Then he turned his men around, They went downstairs. Daniel stood on the stairs and listened. Screams, clanging, hissing, roaring. Then a crash. Then silence. Long, terrifying. Then footsteps coming up the stairs. The senior guard emerged from the darkness, wet, smoky, with a burn on his left arm. He said they'd driven Cromaha back. The water had worked. The creature had been blinded by the steam. They'd managed to throw the runic chains over it, locked it back up. He looked at Daniel, asked how he'd known about the water. Daniel said a prisoner from the third circle had told him. The senior guard was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said he would report to the captain. He turned and left. 2 hours later, Daniel was summoned to Holloway's office. The captain was sitting at his desk, his face ashen. A report lay in front of him. 3 wounded, 1 seriously. Chroma was back in his cell. The seals had been restored. He looked at Daniel. He said that the senior guard on the 5th circle had written in his report that the decision to turn on the water had been made by junior guard Sho, based on information received from a prisoner on the 3rd circle. Holloway repeated this slowly. From a prisoner. Daniel stood at attention. He said it was true, that the inmate in cell 3G knew Chroma's weakness, that without that information, the guards wouldn't have been able to stop the escape. Holloway asked why the inmate had helped. Daniel replied that it was because he had asked him to. Holloway dropped his pen on the table. He said that was impossible, that inmates never help the guards. Never. Not a single instance in 2,000 years. Daniel didn't argue. He just stood there. Holloway looked at him. Then he put the report in the drawer. He said that the official report would state that the guards had released the water based on a tactical decision by the commander of the 5th circle. Daniel's name would not be mentioned. The prisoner's name would not be mentioned, for the safety of both of them. Daniel nodded. He turned toward the door. Holloway called out to him over his shoulder. He said his great-grandfather's name was Corvin, and that if Daniel could really find out what happened to him, Holloway would owe him one. Not by the rules, as a human being. Daniel returned to the guardhouse. Hawan was waiting for him. Her eyes were red. She thought he was dead. She punched him in the shoulder. It hurt. Then she let go. Briefly, for a second, she let him go. She said that if he ever ran toward a flesh-eater again, she'd kill him herself. Daniel sat down on the cot. He closed his eyes. He thought about Cromaha, about the escape that hadn't happened in 20 years, about Lorenzo and his visit, about the cases that had vanished, about the fact that someone up there wants things to go badly in Angelmo, and he's working to make things better, and that makes him an enemy. He opened his notebook. He wrote on a blank page, Cromox's escape. No coincidence. Check who had access to the 7th circle cell last week. Check the condition of the seals. Who stands to gain from the escape? He closed the notebook, hid it under the stove, lay down. He fell asleep instantly. For the first time in 2 months, his body had overcome his mind. In cell 3G, Wurm lay by the bars, calm. He had helped. For the first time in 200 years, his knowledge had come in handy. For the first time, someone had asked instead of ordering. 6 eyes glimmered in the darkness, quiet, like a lighthouse. The flesh devourer Chroma had broken out of the 7th circle. Daniel received information from Wurm about the creature's weakness and directed water from the cistern into the corridors. The guards drove Chroma back. Holloway concealed the involvement of Daniel and the prisoner in his report. For the first time in 2,000 years, a prisoner had helped the... Daniel suspects that the escape was organized by Kane's people. After Chroma's escape, Anhelm changed. Not on the outside. On the outside, everything was as before. Stone, torches, silence. But on the inside the people. The guards of the 3rd circle looked at Daniel differently. Not like an oddball, like a man who knows something they don't. Morley stopped calling him a rookie. Brennan nodded to him in the hallway. 2 junior guards from the 4th circle came to him on their own. They asked if it was true that a prisoner had helped stop Chroma. Daniel said it was true. They were silent. Then one asked how he'd managed it. Daniel replied that he'd asked. He'd simply asked. They left, puzzled. But a week later, Daniel noticed that one of them had started lingering by the cells during his rounds. For 5 seconds longer. That was enough. For now. On the 56th day, Daniel got what he'd been looking for Holloway. Eleanor was working. The ink he'd brought her turned out to be the best investment of his entire career. She was recalling, writing it down, cross-referencing it with what she knew. 3 centuries in a cell hadn't killed her memory. An elven memory works differently. It isn't erased, it builds up in layers. You just have to find the right layer. She found it. Corvin Holloway, a guard in the 4th Circle. 53 years ago, he had been assigned to a prisoner who had been temporarily transferred from the lower circles. The transfer was strange. Usually, prisoners aren't moved between circles, but this one was moved, upward, to the 4th Circle, officially for a medical examination. Eleanor remembered because the prisoner was unusual. Not a demon, a human, an old man. His name was Yorick. Daniel froze. Yorick. The name surfaced from the depths of his consciousness, from that part of his memory that belonged neither to Daniel Shaw nor to Dan Show. From something else, something that had come with him when he woke up on the stone floor. He asked Eleanor to continue. She told him. Yorick was an inmate from the upper circles, the 1st or 2nd circle. He'd been there a long time, 40 years, quiet, harmless. He'd been transferred to the 4th circle ostensibly for an examination. Corvin Holloway was on duty with him, and he found documents on Yorick, hidden, stitched into the lining of his prison uniform. Corvin reported it to the authorities. The next day, Corvin disappeared. Yorick was transferred back. The documents were confiscated. Eleanor didn't know what was in the documents, but she knew one thing. A week after these events, a man dressed in conclave garb came to her cell. Faceless, wearing a mask. He asked if she knew anything about Yorick. She said no. The man left. No one spoke of Yorick again. Daniel sat by Eleanor's cell bars and thought. Yorick. The documents. Corvin found them and disappeared, killed or imprisoned or both. He thanked Eleanor. She stopped him. She said she had something else. She remembered Yorick's cell number on the 4th circle, 4C. And she remembered that after Yorick was taken away, the cell wasn't cleaned. Usually, after a transfer, the cell is cleaned. They take away personal belongings. They clean it out. Cell 4C hadn't been cleaned. They'd just locked it up and forgotten about it. Daniel looked at her. Eleanor looked at him. She said that cell 4C was 100 steps from her cell, on the left side of the corridor. Daniel stood up. He walked down the hallway. Cell 4C was empty. The bars were locked. The runes were extinguished. He looked through the bars. It was empty inside. A stone floor, stone walls. Nothing. He returned to Eleanor. He told her the cell was empty. She nodded. Then she said that Yorick had been an archivist. Before he was imprisoned, he had worked in the Conclave's archives. 40 years in a cell is a long time. But an archivist is someone who knows where to hide things. The stone walls all look the same, but the stone is porous. Daniel returned to cell 4C. He checked the lock. None of the keys from Morley's bunch fit. Holloway's pass worked on the gate of the 4th circle. He entered the cell. He got down on his knees. He began tapping the floor. The stone sounded the same. Solid. Hollow. He tapped for 20 minutes. Then he moved on to the walls. The bottom row of stones. Tap, tap, tap. All the same. Tap. A different sound. Slightly higher. Slightly more resonant. A hollow space. He pressed down on the stone. The stone didn't budge. He tried to shift it. To the left. To the right. Down. The stone wavered. It gave way 2 fingers' width. Behind it was a crevice. Narrow. Daniel slipped his hand in. His fingers felt fabric. He pulled out a bundle. Small. the size of a palm, wrapped in a piece of a robe, tied with a thread. He unwrapped it. Inside were sheets of paper, thin, covered in small handwriting, not in ink,
In blood. Old. Brown. Faded. But still legible.
Daniel held the sheets up to the light of the torch in the hallway. He read the first line. I am Yorick, archivist of the Conclave. I am writing this because I will soon die, and this evidence must be found by someone who can use it. Daniel read on. There were 7 sheets, fine handwriting, in blood. Every letter was carefully formed. Yorick wrote about the lower circles, about documents he had seen in the sealed archives, about sentences that never were, about prisoners who were never tried, about the 12th circle and Lilith Morvain, about how her case file contains not a single page of charges, about how the Conclave is built on lies, about how the War of the Seals did not end as it is written in the books. On the last page was a line that made Daniel sink to the floor of the cell. If you're reading this, it means I did it right. I performed the ritual to pass on the testimony. I summoned you from the edge of the world. I don't know who you are, but I know why you're here. Finish my work. Daniel sat on the floor of the empty cell, holding 7 sheets covered in the blood of the man who had died so that he might live.
Now he knew.
It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a fluke. Yorick had summoned him, chosen him through the world grid. The selection criteria? A person whose profession is to listen to those who aren't listened to. A social worker from Portland. He folded the sheets, wrapped them back in the cloth, hid them under his chainmail. He left the cell. He locked the bars. He returned to the 3rd circle. In the guard room, he sat down on the cot. He took out the bundle. He reread it. Then he hid it along with the notebooks under a stone slab, and he went on his rounds. Cell 3G, Wurm, was waiting. Daniel sat down. He was silent. Wurm sat silently beside him. Then Daniel said quietly that he now knew why he was here. Wurm didn't ask why. He just pressed his snout closer to the bars, like a dog beside a master who's feeling unwell. Eleanor helped piece together the story of Corvin Holloway and Yorick. Daniel found 4 items in the empty cell, Yorick's hiding place containing documents written in blood. He learned that Yorick had been the Conclave's archivist, who had been gathering evidence of fabricated verdicts. He learned that it was Yorick who had performed the ritual that transferred Daniel's soul into Danshow's body. Now Daniel has direct evidence of the Conclave's lies. Daniel showed Yorick's documents to Holloway. He did this in the evening, in the office, with the door closed. Holloway read the 7 pages for 20 minutes. Then he laid them on the table. His hands didn't tremble, but his face turned ashen. He asked where Daniel had found them. Daniel told him, Cell 4C, that compartment in the wall. Eleanor had pointed it out. Holloway nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked about Corvin. Daniel said that Corvin had found an earlier version of these documents at Yorick's place. He reported it, and then he disappeared. Most likely he was imprisoned, or killed. Most likely the documents Corvin found have been destroyed. But Yorick had written new ones, in blood, in a hiding place that hadn't been checked in 50 years. Holloway stood up. He walked over to the map of Anhelm. He stared at the 12 circles, for a minute, 2. Then he turned around. He said that his whole life he'd believed that Anhelm was a holy cause, that protecting demons was an honor, that his family served the truth. And the truth was that his great-grandfather wasn't killed by a demon. He was killed by his own people, for being honest. Daniel remained silent. Holloway said he needed time, a day or 2, to decide. Daniel nodded. He took the documents and left. For 2 days he worked as usual. Rounds, the archives, records, Wurm, Hawan, Eleanor. Routine. The routine that kept him afloat. On the 3rd day, Holloway summoned him. Hawan was sitting in the office with the captain. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. Holloway said he'd told her everything. Everything. About the documents, about Corvin, about the archives, about the empty cells on the 10th circle. Hawan knew. Daniel turned to her. She spoke briefly. She said that the Angelma Charter was written to protect prisoners and guards, that the Conclave had violated the Charter. Not Daniel, the Conclave. And that if the Charter didn't work up above, she would follow it down below, her own understanding of the Charter, the one that protects. Holloway placed a key on the table, a large, dark key with a rune on the head. He said it was the master key to the 3rd and 4th circles that Daniel now has access, official access, under the cover of a behavioral assessment that Holloway had approved as a permanent program. Daniel picked up the key. It was heavy. Holloway said one more thing. He said that to reach the lower circles, one needs clearance that he doesn't have. Only the Conclave has that kind of clearance. Or the Conclave's inspection department. Or... Holloway fell silent. Daniel finished his thought. Or whoever the Conclave invites upstairs. Lorenz had offered him a transfer to the Holy See. Daniel refused. But if he accepted the offer, if he ended up upstairs, if he got into the administrative building where the 3rd level of the archive is located, the vault, all the documents the Conclave cannot destroy. Holloway nodded. Hawan said it was a trap, that they'd devour him up there. Daniel agreed. He said it was a trap. But you can walk into a trap knowing it's a trap, and take what you need from there, and get out. If there's someone to cover for him, Holloway said he'd cover for him. Hawan said she'd cover for him. The plan was simple. Daniel accepts Lorenz's offer. He goes up to the Holy See. He gets an administrative position. He finds the vault. He takes the evidence. He comes back down. Simple. Deadly dangerous, but simple. Before going upstairs, he had to do one thing. Go down. To the 12th circle. To Lilith. He'd been preparing for this for 2 months. He'd read everything he could find about her in the archives. He found very little. Or rather, nothing. The Lilith Morvain file was missing from the public archives. According to Eleanor, it wasn't in the restricted section either. It was either in the vault upstairs or had been destroyed. Everything he knew about her came from Yorick's records and from widely known legends. The Queen of Darkness. Leader of the Dark Host. She lost the war. Imprisoned for eternity. Bound to the fabric of the world. Cannot be killed. That's the official version. Yorick wrote something else. Yorick wrote that there wasn't a single document in the restricted archives regarding Lilith's interrogation. Not a single piece of testimony. Not a single transcript. Only the verdict. No charges. Just like with Eleanor. Like with Silvar. Like with dozens of others. Only the scale is different. Eleanor was imprisoned for a book. Silvar for a report. Lilith for what? Holloway retrieved the second key. This one was different. White, made of bone, with a triple rune. The key to the staircase leading below the 5th circle. He said he'd received it 20 years ago, when he became captain. He'd never used it. He said it was against all the rules, that if they found out, they'd remove him from his post and imprison him. Daniel took the key. He went down that night, alone. Past the 5th circle, past the 6th, the 7th. Each circle was smaller than the last, darker, heavier. The air grew thicker. It weighed down on his shoulders. The 8th circle, the 9th, the 10th. Empty. Wurm and Silvar were right. 20 chambers, all open, all empty. 200 years of emptiness. The 11th circle, 5 chambers, 3 occupied. Something emanated from the chambers, neither heat nor cold. Something that made his skin burn and go numb at the same time. Daniel didn't stop. He walked past. A staircase leading down, narrow, just wide enough for one person. The steps were hewn into the rock. He counted the steps. 240 steps. At the 241st step, the staircase ended. Before him was a door, a stone door, with a rune as tall as a man. The rune flickered, dimly. Behind the door lay the 12th circle, one chamber.
He pushed the door. It opened silently. The 12th circle was small, a circular room 20 paces in diameter. The ceiling was low. The walls were covered with runes so densely that the stone was invisible. In the center stood a cage, not a grate, a cage, made of rune glass, transparent, shimmering. It was bright inside, a soft light with no source. And inside sat a woman, on a stone bench, in a simple, dark dress. Her hands were on her knees. Her hair was black, long, floor-length. Her face was young, 25, maybe 30. Her eyes were dark, deep, calm. She was looking at him, not with surprise, not with hostility, calmly, as if she were waiting. Daniel walked up to the glass. He sat down on the floor, just as he had sat down by cell 3G, just as he had sat down by cell 5M, just as he had sat down by cell 4R. He said his name was Dan, that he was a third circle guard, that he had come without permission, that he'd read her case file, that there was no case, that there was only a verdict without charges, and that he wanted to know what had really happened. Lilith Morvain looked at him. 2,000 years. That's how long she'd been waiting. She smiled. The smile was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. She said he was amusing, that he had an interesting way of starting a conversation with the Queen of Darkness. Daniel replied that he'd started a conversation with a devourer who had 3 pairs of jaws. It's easier with the Queen. She has at least one. Lilith blinked. Then she laughed, quietly. The sound echoed off the walls of the 12th circle. The runes flared and went out. Somewhere above, in the 11th circle, something rumbled. She stopped laughing. She looked at him seriously. She said he was the first in 2,000 years to come and ask rather than command. The first to sit on the floor rather than stand over her. The first to give his name before demanding hers. Daniel nodded. He said he wasn't in a hurry, that he'd come back, that if she wanted to talk, he'd listen. If she didn't want to, he'd sit beside her. He stood up. He walked toward the door. Lilith called out to him over his shoulder. She told him her name. Just her name. Lilith. Not the Queen of Darkness, not a ruler, not a title. A name. Daniel turned around. He nodded. He said he was glad to meet her, and he left. On the stairs, his legs gave way. He sat down on a step. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the fact that behind the calm and the smile in her eyes, there was so much pain. Enough 1,000 human lives. And in 2,000 years, no one had ever asked where she came from. Holloway and Hawan joined Daniel. They devised a plan. Daniel would accept Lorenz's offer of a transfer upstairs to gain access to the document vault. Before that, he went down to the 12th circle and met Lilith Morvain for the first time. He made contact. Lilith told him her name. For the next 3 months, Daniel lived a double life. Upstairs, he was an assistant to Lorenz's assistant in the administrative wing of the Holy See. He carried papers. He sorted reports. He smiled. He was quiet, helpful, inconsequential. Lorenz was pleased. He reported to Cardinal Kane that the young guard had proven to be obedient and manageable. Downstairs at night, Daniel would go down to Anhelm 3 times a week, down the staircase that Haiwan kept clear, past the guard posts that Holloway left unmanned for 20 minutes. He made his rounds. The 3rd circle hadn't forgotten him. Wurm was waiting every time. Water stood by the grate. 20 of the 40 cells responded to him now. 20. Half the circle. Hawan led the rounds in his absence. She couldn't do it the way he did. She couldn't listen as deeply. But she came. She called the prisoners by name. She brought water to Wurm. That was enough. Presence, regularity, predictability. Eleanor wrote, every day, with the ink that Daniel passed to her through Hawan. She was restoring her book, adding to it, correcting it.
3 centuries in a cell had given her a perspective she didn't have when she first wrote it. The book was getting better, more precise, more terrifying. Silvar, on the 5th circle, began to speak. Not to Daniel. He came too rarely. Silvar began to speak to Hawan. She visited him once a week. She sat by the bars. She remained silent. Then he began to tell her about the Silver Order, about the Paladins, about how they believed they were protecting the world, and about how the world decided it didn't need them. Hawan listened. She was the daughter of a hero. Silvar was a hero. They understood each other. Upstairs, Daniel was searching for the vault. The administrative wing of the Holy See was a labyrinth. Corridors, offices, meeting rooms, libraries, archives. He explored it methodically, just as he had explored Anhelm, room by room, corridor by corridor. He memorized it. He committed it to memory. By the 3rd week, he found a staircase leading down, not to Anhelm, beneath the Holy See, a separate entrance, locked, sealed with the conclave's seal, the 3rd level of the archive, the vault. He couldn't get in. The seal responded only to the cardinal's blood. He needed another way in. He found it through Sabina Ashcroft. Lady Sabina appeared in his life during his 2nd week upstairs. Young, beautiful, the daughter of one of the conclave members. She approached him at a reception, struck up a conversation. She was charming, intelligent. She took an interest in his work. Daniel recognized this type right away. An agent, a plant. He didn't know by whom exactly, Cain or the opposition to Cain. He didn't expose her. Instead, he talked to her, just as he talked to everyone else, genuinely. He listened, he observed. After a month, he knew enough about her. She was tired of lying, tired of being a pawn. Her father had used her. The faction had used her. Her suitors saw only her family name, not the person she was. No one had ever once asked what she wanted. In the 6th week of their acquaintance, Daniel caught her. She threw his things in his study, looking for documents, notes, anything compromising. She froze. Her face went pale. She waited for threats. Daniel closed the door. He sat down. He said he understood she'd been forced into it. He asked what they'd do to her if she didn't turn him in. Sabina looked at him. 10 seconds. 20. Then she said her father would marry her off to Baron Grace, who was 62, who had buried 3 wives. That was the price of failure. Daniel nodded. He said they'd think it over together. She broke down at that phrase. She didn't cry. Sabina Ashcroft didn't cry. She simply stopped acting. She pulled off the mask. Beneath the mask was a weary 27-year-old woman who wanted only one thing, for her life to belong to her. Daniel asked who she was working for. She said that she worked for the opposition faction, Cain's opponents, people who wanted to oust the cardinal. Not because they were better, but because they wanted his position. Daniel asked if the opposition could help him get into the vault. Sabina said they could. Her father was a member of the conclave. He had access. He had the cardinal's blood, which could break the seal. Daniel asked what the price was. Sabina said that the opposition wanted documents from the vault, compromising evidence against Cain. They were willing to grant access in exchange for copies. Daniel thought it over. It was dangerous. Cain's opposition was no better than Cain himself, just more predators. The same methods. But he needed access, and there was no other way. He agreed. 3 days later, at night, Sabina led him into the vault. A staircase led down. A seal. A drop of blood from the vial Sabina had brought from her father. The door opened. The vault was enormous, more like an open archive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, thousands of folders, thousands of files, thousands of lives hidden beneath the Holy See. Daniel began his search. He had 2 hours. That was all Sabina could arrange. He found the section on the lower circles, the 10th circle. 20 cases. All of them were here. all marked for destruction. The order hadn't been carried out, because the 7 cardinals couldn't reach an agreement. He found the section for the 12th circle. One folder, thick, heavy. A name on the cover, Lilith Morvain. He opened it. Everything was inside. Interrogations, testimonies, transcripts, letters, battle naps. And at the very bottom of the folder lay the document that changed everything. A ceasefire agreement, dated the final year of the War of the Seals, signed by Lilith Morvain of the Dark Host and by the 3 leaders of the Light Coalition. A truce, a peace treaty, signed by both sides. The war could have ended in peace. Lilith had negotiated it. The 3 coalition leaders had signed. The other 4 had not. And those 4, Daniel looked at the signatures of those who had refused. 4 names, the founders of the conclave, the direct ancestors of the current cardinals, including an ancestor of Vesper Cain. They refused not because peace was a bad thing. They refused because the war gave them power. Peace stripped them of their army and their mandate. They betrayed Lilith. They betrayed their own who had signed. They locked her away. They rewrote history. They declared themselves the victors. They built the conclave on lies. Daniel stood in the vault holding a document that was 2,000 years old, a peace treaty signed by the Queen of Darkness, the woman who sits in a glass cage at the bottom of an extinct volcano, for wanting peace. He took the folder, the whole thing. He took the files from the 10th circle. He took everything he could carry. He gave copies of the compromising documents to Sabine as agreed. He left the vault. He went down to Anhelm. Daniel had been working upstairs at the Holy See for 3 months. He exposed Sabine Ashcroft as a spy and won her over to his side. With Sabine's help, he infiltrated the conclave's vault. He found the file on Lilith Morvain and a peace treaty that was 2,000 years old. He learned that the conclave's founders had shattered the peace and imprisoned Lilith for trying to stop the war. He took the documents. He didn't make it in time. Cardinal Cain set his plan in motion sooner than Daniel had expected. That night, as Daniel descended to Anhelm with the documents, Cain's men arrived at the prison. It wasn't an inspection. A squad. 30 mercenaries with artifacts, disguised in guard uniforms, with forged orders. They went down to the 7th circle, to the 8th. They began removing the seals, opening the cells. They released those whom Daniel would never have released, those whose files stated they posed a real threat, whose crimes were not fabricated but real. Devourers, destroyers, creatures without memory or mercy. Cain's plan was simple. A breakthrough, chaos, corpses, a guilty guard, a state of emergency, absolute power. Anhelm burst into flames at 4 in the morning. Not metaphorically. The fiery demon's cell in the 8th circle burst open. Flames raced through the corridors. Stone melted. Iron flowed. A roar rose from below. Not from a single creature, from several. 5, 10. Daniel was on the 3rd circle when the walls began to shake. Ha-Wan burst into the guard room. She said there was a breach coming from below, that Holloway was gathering the guards, that Cain's mercenaries had been spotted on the 6th circle, that there weren't enough guards to handle them all. Daniel grabbed the folder of documents, tucked it under his arm, ran downstairs. On the staircase between the circles, he ran into Holloway. The captain was in full armor, with a sword. His face was stern. He said the mercenaries had opened the cells on the 7th and 8th circles. At least 7 creatures were on the loose. The guards were holding them back on the 5th circle, but they wouldn't hold out for long. Daniel asked what was happening upstairs. Holloway said Cain was upstairs. He was already drafting a decree, a state of emergency, emergency powers, a mop-up operation. His men had blocked the exit from Angelma. No one would leave until he gave the order. They were trapped. Monsters below, an army above. Daniel thought for 3 seconds. Then he told Holloway to hold the 5th circle, at any cost. Hay-1 was sent to Eleanor on the 4th circle, to bring her back, to bring her to the stairs of the 12th circle, with the manuscript, with all the scrolls. He himself ran down, through the 5th circle, past the guard standing like a wall, past Brennan, who was holding the runic shield with both hands, past the fire, past the screams. On the 6th circle, he ran into the mercenaries, 3 of them, in fake uniforms, with artifacts on their belts. They hadn't expected to see a guard heading down when everyone else was running up. Daniel didn't fight. He didn't know how.
He slipped past them into a side passage. The mercenaries didn't chase him. They had more important things to do. They needed to open more chambers. The 7th circle was ablaze. Droplets of molten stone were dripping from the ceiling. The heat was unbearable. Daniel ran crouched down, shielding his face with his sleeve. 8th, 9th, 10th. Empty. Dead. 11th. Past the cells from which something invisible and oppressive emanated. A staircase leading down. 240 steps, he counted automatically. On the 241st step, he pushed open the door to the 12th circle. Lilith was standing there. Not sitting, she was standing in the middle of the cage. Her hands were down, her eyes were open. She could sense everything that was happening upstairs, every blow, every scream, every seal being torn off. She was tethered to the fabric of the world. She could feel the world cracking. Daniel walked up to the glass. He took out a folder, set it on the floor, opened it, showed her the truce agreement, told her he'd found it, that he knew the truth, that she'd wanted peace, that she'd been betrayed, that the conclave was built on lies. Lilith looked at the document.
At her signature, 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, she'd thought that maybe they were right. Maybe she really did deserve it. Maybe peace was impossible. And here was her own signature. And the signatures of the 3 coalition leaders who had agreed. Peace was possible. It had been stolen. She looked up. Daniel saw tears in her eyes, the first in 2,000 years. There was a rumbling above. The walls were shaking. Heat was pouring down the stairs. Daniel took out the key. Holloway had given him the key to the runic seal of the 12th circle, the master key to the final lock. Lilith looked at the key, then at him, calmly, just like when they first met. She said quietly, "Open it, or don't open it." She would accept either decision. Daniel said he wouldn't open the cage. He would open the door. He inserted the key into the lock of the upper seal, the one that had been silencing her voice, and turned it. The rune flared up. Then it went out. The upper seal was broken. Lilith sighed, deeply, like a person who had been breathing through a rag for 2,000 years and had finally removed it. Daniel said that Eleanor would be coming soon, with her book, with the evidence, and that he needed Lilith's voice. Not magic, not power. Her voice, her true testimony, the names of those who started the war, the names of those who prevented it from ending. The truth they had been waiting for 20 centuries. Lilith nodded. Ha-Wang came down the stairs. Eleanor followed her, carrying an armful of scrolls. For the first time in 312 years, the elf stood outside her cell. She staggered. Ha-Wang steadied her. Eleanor looked at Lilith through the glass. Lilith looked at Eleanor. The historian and the witness. 2,000 years later. Eleanor spoke a single sentence. She said she was ready to take notes. Lilith began to speak. Cardinal Kane launched the breakout plan. Mercenaries opened the chambers of the 7th and 8th circles. Anhelm is burning. Daniel reached the 12th circle and showed Lilith the peace treaty. He removed the upper seal, freeing her voice. Eleanor and Ha-Wang came down to them. Lilith began to testify. Lilith Morvaine's voice rose upward. Through the stone, through the 12 circles, through the walls of Anhelm, through the foundation of the Holy See. She wasn't screaming.
She wasn't giving orders.
She was speaking, evenly, calmly, like a witness in court. She was naming names. Those who started the war, those who rejected the peace treaty, those who imprisoned her without trial, those who rewrote history, those whose descendants sit in the conclave now. Her voice traveled through the stones like water through cracks. Everyone heard it. On every circle, in every cell, at every guard post. The guards on the 5th circle froze. The mercenaries on the 6th circle stopped. The creatures that had broken out of their cells fell silent. Even the fire on the 7th circle burned more quietly. Because Lilith Morvaine's voice carried no magic. It carried the truth. And the truth sounded as only that which had been kept silent for 2,000 years can sound. Up above, in the square before the Holy Throne, Cardinal Vesper Cain stood. Before him lay the decree declaring a state of emergency. A quill in his hand. Surrounding him were his men, the conclave guard, officials, and the crowd gathered for the demonstration. Everything was ready. All that remained was to sign it. And then a voice echoed across the cobblestones of the square. Quiet, steady, clear, each word like the toll of a bell. The names of the conclave's founders, a description of how they had derailed the peace treaty. Details, dates, the names of witnesses. Cain dropped the quill. The square fell silent. The voice continued. It went on for 10 minutes, 15, 20. Lilith spoke. Eleanor took notes. Daniel sat on the floor of the 12th circle and listened. Hawan stood nearby, holding her halberd in the proper grip. She was guarding the staircase. No one came down. Upstairs, Holloway had intercepted Cain's mercenaries on the 5th circle. The guards who had been retreating 10 minutes ago were now standing their ground to the death, because the voice from below had given them what they'd lacked since the breach began, a reason to stand their ground. Brennan was leading 6 men against 20 mercenaries. Morley was holding the staircase on the 4th circle. The 2 junior guards who, a month ago, had asked Daniel how he talked to demons were standing shoulder to shoulder on the 3rd circle. And in the cells of the 3rd circle, it was quiet. All 40 cells. Quiet. Not a single incident. Not a single escape attempt. Even Wurm lay quietly by the bars. He was looking down the corridor, waiting. They were all waiting, because Lilith's voice spoke for them too. For everyone imprisoned without trial, for everyone forgotten, for everyone whose case consisted of just 2 pages. The voice fell silent. Lilith sat down, heavily, wearily. Eleanor finished writing, the last scroll. She raised her head. Her eyes were bright. Her cheeks were... She said she had written everything down, that this was the complete testimony of a witness to the War of the Seals, that this would be enough for the tribunal. Daniel nodded. He stood up. His legs were numb. He walked over to the glass wall. Lilith was sitting on a bench. Her eyes were closed. Her face was pale. She spoke without opening her eyes. She asked him not to let her go. Not yet. The trial first. She wanted to be released according to the law, not out of mercy, by a court decision, a real one, with her voice, with her right to a defense, with a verdict that no one could challenge. Daniel said there would be a trial. Lilith opened her eyes. She looked at him. She asked if he promised. Daniel said he did. She closed her eyes. She nodded, quietly. He took out a thermos. He'd been carrying it around for 3 months. Tea. He poured it into 2 mugs. He slipped one through the gap between the glass and the floor. Lilith took the mug. She held it with both hands. She didn't drink. She just held it. Warm. For the first time in 2,000 years, she held something warm in her hands. Upstairs, an old era was coming to an end. Cain was arrested by his own guards an hour after the voice fell silent. His men laid down their weapons. The decree declaring a state of emergency lay unsigned on the stones of the square. The conclave met until dawn. Of the 7 cardinals, 4 demanded an immediate tribunal. 2 tried to flee.
One sat down at the table and asked to see the documents. They showed them to him. He read until noon. Then he signed his consent to the tribunal. The breach was sealed by morning. The creatures were returned to their cells. No bloodshed. Holloway led the operation personally. The guards lost 4 men to injuries, not a single fatality. Kane's mercenaries were locked in the first circle cells. 30 men. Symbolic. A prison for prison guards. A week later, the tribunal began. Not a conclave trial. Caldera's tribunal. The first in 200 years. It wasn't the demons who were on trial, it was the system. Daniel testified. He presented Yorick's documents. He presented files from the archives. He presented the peace treaty. He presented his notebooks. 60 pages of records, 40 cells in the third circle, 20 cells in the fifth, 30 cells in the fourth. Every name, every story, every discrepancy. The tribunal worked for 3 months. The cases were reviewed one by one. Eleanor Findariel was the first to be released. 312 years for a book. The tribunal ruled the sentence unlawful. She left Angelna at noon. She stood on the surface. She squinted against the sun she hadn't seen in 3 centuries. Hawan stood beside her, holding her by the elbow so she wouldn't fall. Sister Irene Weil was the second to be released. 8 years for choosing a peasant woman over a cardinal. Daniel found that peasant woman, alive, with 3 children. He brought her to the meeting. Irene held in her arms the child she had saved at the cost of 8 years in a cell. She cried, quietly, like someone who had finally received an answer to the question of whether it had been worth it. It had been worth it. Silvar the Cold was the third to be released. 214 years for a report on empty cells. He stepped out in armor that had once been white. He stood in the square, upright, gray-haired. His eyes were dry. His wife, Mayra, was found in a village in the north, alive. She had waited 200 years, because the paladin had promised to return. And he did. Mina Sol learned the truth about her mother. Daniel told her himself, in Anhelma's kitchen, gently, by the book. He didn't just dump it on her. He guided her through it. Mina cried for a full day. On the second day, she came into the kitchen. She said she wanted to know what kind of food her mother had liked. Eleanor told her. She remembered. Elven memories never fade. Sabina Ashcroft testified against her father and against the opposition faction. Both sides turned out to be corrupt. She knew it. The tribunal offered her protection. She refused. She said she wouldn't hide anymore. For the first time in her life, her decision was her own. Half of the lower circles were emptied. Sentences were reviewed. Prisoners were released or transferred to conditions befitting sentient beings. Those who were truly dangerous remained. But now they had cases, real ones, with charges, with the right to appeal, with their names on the cover. Half of the upper circles were filled with the former conclave. Kane sat in a cell in the first circle, without a mask, without power, without decrees, just a man in a cell. Daniel came to see him once. He sat down by the bars, just as he sat down by all the bars. Kane looked at him. Daniel said he hadn't come to gloat. He'd come to ask. Kane asked what? Daniel asked why. Why the breach? Why the corpses? Why power at such a cost? Kane was silent. Then he said he believed that the world needed a strong hand, that without fear people would fall apart, that demons were a threat, and the only way to manage that threat was through control, absolute control. Daniel nodded. He said he understood, that Kane wasn't the first person to confuse control with care, and he wouldn't be the last. He stood up. He left. He didn't look back. Anhelm had changed. It wasn't a prison. It was a tribunal, a place where cases are heard, where every prisoner has a name, a case, a sentence, and a chance, where appeals are made not with a stick against the bars, but with a voice and a question, where guards are taught to listen, where every cell has a bucket of water if a prisoner needs water, and a pillow if he needs a pillow. Little things, silly things, things that make ancient horrors weep and press their snouts against the bars. Wurm the Thirsty was transferred to an open enclosure with a pond, a small one, but a real one, with reeds, with fish, with frogs that sang at night. He lay on the shore, 6 eyes closed, calm, like a dog that had finally found its way home. Grieve stopped whispering, not right away, gradually, when the silence around him ceased to be empty, when people began to come to him, when his pain ceased to be the only proof that he existed. The whispering faded away. Silence remained, but a different kind, a living silence. Lilith Morvain. The trial took place 6 months after the tribunal. A separate trial, a public one, with a defense attorney, with charges that hadn't been brought in 2,000 years, with evidence, with witness testimony, with a peace treaty on the judge's desk. The verdict took 1 day. Not guilty, not acquitted, not guilty. Because there was no crime. There was a woman who wanted peace, and men for whom peace was not in their interest. Lilith did not come to the surface. She remained in Anhelm, voluntarily, as a consultant to the tribunal on the pre-imperial period, the only living witness to the war. Her cell became an office. The glass was removed. The runes were extinguished. A desk was placed there, a chair, a bookcase. Eleanor came to see her every day. They worked. They wrote history. The real one, unedited, without lies. Once a week, Daniel would come by, with a thermos, with 2 mugs. He'd sit next to her, not across from her, next to her. He'd pour tea. They'd drink in silence. Sometimes she'd tell stories about the war, about the world that never came to be, about 2,000 years in a glass cage, about how silence can kill more surely than a sword. Sometimes he would tell stories about Portland, about teenagers, about the woman on the bridge, about the old man who had been silent for 3 years and then spoke, about the knife under her ribs, about the stone ceiling, about the first morning, about Wurm, about a bucket of water. Lilith listened. She knew how to listen. 2,000 years of solitude had taught her to cherish every word. Once she asked if he missed home. Daniel thought for a moment. He said that home is a place where someone is waiting for you. In Portland, no one was waiting for him. Here, they are waiting for him. Wurm is waiting for water. Hawan is waiting for her rounds. Eleanor is waiting for ink. Mina was waiting for a story about her mother. Silvar was waiting for a report. Holloway was waiting for the morning briefing. Lilith was waiting for tea. He said his home was here. Lilith smiled. Not like the first time. Not beautiful and scary. She just smiled, like a human being. Daniel finished his tea. He stood up. He said he'd come back tomorrow. She nodded. He climbed the stairs. 240 steps. Through the circles. Through the corridors. Past cells where lights were on and water stood. Past guard posts where guards nodded to him by name. Past cell 3G, which was now empty because Wurm was lying by his pond. He emerged onto the surface. For the first time in a long while, he raised his head. Above Anhelm was the sky. Dark, full of stars. Cold. He stood and looked up. Somewhere below, in the former prison, a light was burning. Warm. Alive. A light in a place where for 2,000 years there had been only darkness. He turned around and walked back. Down. Down the steps. Toward those who were waiting. Because that's how it works. Not through force, not through fear. Through presence. Through a dull, stubborn, daily presence. Every day. 1 step at a time. 1 name at a time. 1 mug of tea at a time. Lilith's voice reached the square of the Holy See and shattered Cain's plan. The conclave fell. The tribunal reviewed the sentences. Eleanor, Irene, and Silvar were freed. Lilith was found not guilty and remained in Anhelm as a consultant. Anhelm was transformed from a prison graveyard into a place where everyone has a name, a purpose, and a chance. Daniel found his home.